The neighborhood was quiet, almost serene, on the day that would change Dorothy's life forever. The hum of passing cars and the faint chatter of customers inside the Dairy Queen on the corner seemed like the rhythm of a world Dorothy Stratten had known all her life, a small, safe one. At 17, Dorothy felt the pull of something greater, even if she didn't know what it was yet. She had always been told she was beautiful, but to her it was just a word, nothing she could hold on to or use to build her future. Inside the diner, Dorothy stood behind the counter, her hands working mechanically as she scooped ice cream for another impatient customer. Her golden hair shimmered under the fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the muted beige of her uniform. She looked up for a moment and caught the eye of a man across the room. He wasn't like the regulars who frequented the Dairy Queen. He carried himself with a swagger, his crisp blazer and gold chain gleaming with a confidence that felt foreign here. This man was different, magnetic but also unnervingly intense. Paul Snider approached the counter, his smile too wide, his charm almost too practiced. "You have a face that could stop traffic," he said, his tone playful but deliberate. Dorothy flushed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Compliments were common, but there was something about his gaze that felt calculated, like he wasn't just admiring her beauty, but appraising it. He introduced himself quickly, leaning just a little too close. "I'm Paul," he said, "and I think you could be famous." "Famous?" Dorothy laughed softly, unsure how to respond. She had dreamed of escaping this life, but she never imagined it could happen like this. Paul spoke in vivid details, modeling gigs, glamorous photo shoots, opportunities in California. He painted a world that felt as far from her small-town existence as the stars. And yet, as he spoke, she felt a flicker of hope, a curiosity she couldn't ignore. Her mother was less convinced when Dorothy brought it up that evening. "Famous people don't come out of places like this," her mother said, the word sharp, meant to protect. But Dorothy couldn't shake the idea. Paul had handed her a card before leaving the Dairy Queen, a crisp white rectangle with his name printed in bold black letters. She kept it tucked inside her apron pocket, her fingers grazing the edge of it throughout the night. When Paul returned a week later, Dorothy felt the spark of ambition fully ignite. He showed her photographs of other women he claimed to have helped, glossy, glamorous images that looked like they belonged in a magazine. She tried to imagine herself in those pictures, her reflection almost unrecognizable in her mind's eye. Paul leaned in closer. "You have something special," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "Don't let it go to waste." The first photo shoot happened in a cramped apartment with makeshift lighting and a camera that seemed older than Dorothy. Paul's movements were confident but rushed, his instructions clear but cold. Dorothy felt out of place, unsure if this was the start of something extraordinary or a mistake she couldn't undo. Yet when she saw the photos afterward, she saw a version of herself she hadn't known existed, poised, radiant, almost ethereal. Paul's confidence in her was infectious. Over the next few weeks, he filled her head with stories of fame, opportunities, and the life she could have if she just trusted him. Dorothy felt a mix of exhilaration and trepidation as she prepared to send her portfolio to Playboy. "This is it," Paul had said, his hands gripping hers tightly. "This is your ticket out." As Dorothy sealed the envelope, she caught her reflection in the window. Her eyes, bright but uncertain, stared back at her. Was she ready to leave behind the world she knew? The card in her pocket seemed heavier now, a reminder of the man who had lit the spark in her, for better or for worse. The first time Dorothy walked through the gates of the Playboy mansion, it felt surreal. The world that Paul had promised her was now unfolding before her eyes. She stepped into the lush, manicured lawns of the mansion, the air thick with luxury and possibility. But amidst the glamour and the flashing cameras, Dorothy felt a quiet unease settle in the pit of her stomach. She had always been a small-town girl, raised on simple values, and now she was surrounded by a crowd of beautiful women, all vying for attention. Yet Dorothy stood out. There was something about her, a warmth and natural beauty that drew people in. The photographers, the directors, even the famous faces she met in passing couldn't stop complimenting her. Hugh Hefner took note of her immediately. He was charismatic, a legend in the making, and as he shook her hand that first day, Dorothy could feel the weight of the moment. "You're a star in the making," he said, his voice low but confident, almost as if he had seen something in her that she hadn't even discovered yet. Her head swirled with excitement, But that nagging feeling of discomfort persisted. She had come here for more than just a fleeting moment in the spotlight. But the mansion wasn't what she expected. Behind the glamour and the champagne, there was an undercurrent of power plays and competition that Dorothy hadn't anticipated. The women she met were all beautiful, but they were also calculating. Everyone had an agenda. Meanwhile, Paul watched from the sidelines, his face a mixture of pride and possessiveness. He had always been the one to tell her what to wear, how to act, and what to say. But now, as she garnered attention from people far more influential than him, he could feel a shift. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. Dorothy's rise was swift. Within weeks, she was Playboy's Playmate of the Month, and her name spread like wildfire through Hollywood. Her images, shot by some of the most renowned photographers, graced the pages of magazines. She found herself flying from one photo shoot to another, her life now a blur of flashbulbs and fake smiles. The world seemed at her feet, but the higher she climbed, the more she realized how lonely the view from the top could be. Paul tried to stay relevant, clinging to the coattails of her success. He wasn't blind to the growing distance between them. Every time he accompanied her to a party or a shoot, he found himself surrounded by women far more experienced, far more confident. He became more demanding, more insistent that she was his, and his alone. At times he would even show up uninvited to her shoots, standing at the edges, his eyes scanning every man and woman in the room. Dorothy would notice him in the background, his face a mask of barely contained anger, and she would feel a pang of guilt. She wanted to enjoy her success, but it felt like an impossible balancing act between the man she had married and the woman she was becoming. The first time Paul openly confronted her about her growing friendship with Peter Bogdanovich, Dorothy was shocked. Paul had always been the one to control the narrative of her life, but now, as her career blossomed, she felt suffocated. "I'm just trying to be friends with him," she had told Paul, her voice tinged with frustration. But Paul's eyes darkened, and the possessive edge in his tone made it clear that he wasn't interested in her explanation. "You don't need friends, Dorothy. You need me," Paul said, his voice low but insistent, a coldness creeping into his words. Her chest tightened. She didn't know what to say. Part of her felt sorry for him, but another part of her resented the control he tried to exert. She had come to LA to be more than just Paul's wife. She had come here to be Dorothy Stratten, someone who could stand on her own, someone with her own dreams. But as each day passed, she felt that her identity was slipping further away from her grasp. Still, she had dreams, big ones, dreams of becoming an actress, of being more than just the girl in the Playboy photos. The director's whispers at the shoots, the meetings that ran late into the night. She didn't want to disappoint him, but there was a part of her that yearned for something beyond the confines of the mansion and Paul's watchful eyes. And so, Dorothy kept going, putting one foot in front of the other, smiling through it all. She was becoming the star Paul always told her she could be, but was it the star she wanted to be? As Dorothy's fame continued to rise, the pressure of living in a world of flashing lights and false smiles began to weigh heavily on her. The photo shoots, the parties, the constant barrage of people who wanted a piece of her, it was all starting to feel like a blur. She was supposed to be enjoying the success she had worked so hard for, but instead she found herself slowly becoming a stranger to the person she used to be. And the cracks in her life were starting to show. Paul's behavior, which had always been possessive, now felt like a suffocating grip around her neck. Every day, he became more anxious, more controlling. He'd show up uninvited at her shoots, his eyes scanning the room, his lips pressed tightly together. Dorothy could feel his gaze on her, even when she wasn't looking. There was an intensity to it, one that made her skin crawl. She'd smile for the cameras, pretending everything was fine, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting shoot, Dorothy sat in the back of a limousine, staring out of the window, lost in thought. The city passed by in a blur, another day, another shoot, another step further away from the woman she once was. But the reflection that stared back at her in the glass wasn't her own. It was the face of someone she barely recognized anymore. Paul had been acting strangely ever since the last party, where she'd caught him watching her from the corner of the room, his arms crossed, his eyes narrow. She had tried to talk to him afterward to ask him what was wrong, but his responses had been short, defensive. He hadn't wanted to discuss it. "You've got your own world now, Dorothy," he had said, his voice thick with bitterness. "But you can't forget who helped you get here." Her chest tightened as the words echoed in her mind. She couldn't deny that Paul had been a part of her rise to fame. He had discovered her, guided her, even pushed her to take risks. But as much as she owed him, something inside of her started to rebel against the feeling of being owned. Her relationship with Peter Bogdanovich, the director who had become not only a mentor, but someone Dorothy confided in, only made things more complicated. He was kind, supportive, and most importantly, he made her feel like she was more than just a pretty face. As they spent more time together, Dorothy began to realize how emotionally distant she had grown from Paul. She was no longer the same woman who had walked into his world full of dreams, eager to please. It wasn't long before Paul caught wind of her growing attachment to Peter. One night, as they were leaving an event together, Paul confronted her. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the rage that simmered beneath it. "I know about you and him," he spat. "You think I don't see it?" Dorothy froze. Her heart raced. She had never meant for things to escalate this way, but it was clear now that Paul's jealousy was more than just a passing insecurity. It was consuming him. "I'm not having an affair with him, Paul," she said, her voice trembling. "He's just a friend." "Don't lie to me, Dorothy." His hand slammed against the steering wheel, and Dorothy flinched. "I've seen the way you look at him. You think I'm stupid?" She could feel the temperature in the car drop. Every word he spoke felt like a tightening noose around her chest, choking the words she wanted to say. She had wanted to distance herself, to be free, but with every word, Paul was pulling her back into a life she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. "I don't want to fight," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Paul let out a harsh laugh. "Too bad. We're already fighting, Dorothy. You just don't see it." The silence between them was suffocating as he sped down the dark road. Dorothy wanted to speak, to tell him everything, how she felt trapped, how she had lost herself in a relationship that once felt like a dream, but had slowly turned into a nightmare. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there, frozen, staring out of the window as the city lights blurred by. When they reached home, Paul didn't speak to her. He just slammed the door behind him, leaving Dorothy alone in the dimly lit hallway. The house, which had once been a symbol of their shared dreams, now felt like a cage. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of everything she had ignored finally crashed down on her. She realized how far she had fallen, how far she had let Paul pull her into his world, into a life that wasn't truly hers. She wanted to be free, but every step toward freedom seemed like a step further away from the woman she used to be. Dorothy had always been able to see the good in people. It was one of the qualities that had first drawn Paul to her. But now, as the weeks passed in the suffocating orbit of his possessiveness, the good in Paul seemed harder to find. The relationship that had once felt like a partnership had turned into a battlefield, with her heart in the crossfire. She felt as if every move she made was being watched, calculated, and dissected. Even her silence wasn't enough to escape his scrutiny. The first time she truly felt the weight of his jealousy wasn't at a shoot, or even at a party, but at home. It was an ordinary evening, one that should have been like any other, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Dorothy had been sitting in the living room, flicking through a magazine, trying to lose herself in the glossy pages of someone else's life, when Paul walked in, his footsteps heavy, deliberate. "Who's that?" he asked sharply, pointing to a picture of Peter Bogdanovich in a magazine. Dorothy looked up, her breath catching in her throat. "It's Peter," she replied quietly, trying to keep the peace. "Peter?" His voice was tight with something darker than curiosity. "Why is he in your magazine?" "He's just a director, a friend," she answered, offering him the same line she'd repeated a dozen times. But Paul wasn't listening, his eyes narrowed. "A friend, huh? You got a funny way of showing friendship, Dorothy." He stepped closer, his fists clenching as he loomed over her. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive, until he spoke again, his words cutting through the stillness. "You think I'm stupid? I know what's going on between you two. Everyone can see it." Dorothy froze. She had been trying to keep her distance from Paul's accusations, but this was different. His words weren't just filled with suspicion. There was a sense of certainty in them, as if he had already decided what was true, regardless of what she said. "It's nothing, Paul. We're just working together," she said softly, hoping that her calmness might diffuse the situation. But he didn't calm down. His anger seemed to fill the room, making the walls close in on her. "Don't lie to me," Paul spat, his voice rising. "I see the way you look at him, the way he looks at you. Don't think I'm blind to it." He grabbed her arm then, pulling her roughly from the couch, his grip tight enough to bruise. Dorothy's heart raced, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had never seen him this way, so completely unhinged. She tried to pull away, but his hold was too strong. "I'm not having an affair with him," she said desperately, her voice trembling. She couldn't tell if she was trying to convince him or herself. "Then why are you so damn protective of him?" he snarled, shaking her. "Why do you spend more time with him than me?" Her mind raced. She couldn't explain it. There was no justification she could give that would calm Paul down, and she knew it. But she couldn't stop the truth from slipping out. "Because I can't talk to you like I talk to him. He listens, Paul." Paul's face twisted with fury. "So what? You're just going to leave me for him?" His voice broke, almost a whisper. "After everything I've done for you?" Dorothy wanted to scream that she wasn't leaving him, that she hadn't planned to, but the words wouldn't come. The fear that had been building inside her for weeks, no, for months, was suddenly too overwhelming. She didn't know if she was afraid of what Paul might do to her, or if she was terrified of what she was becoming because of him. He let go of her arm abruptly, as if he just realized how tightly he was holding her. The silence that followed felt even more suffocating. She stared at him, unable to say anything. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. "Don't worry," Paul muttered, backing away, his voice low and dangerous. I'll show you. I'll show you who really cares about you." The words hung in the air long after he left the room. Dorothy sat there, frozen, trying to make sense of the chaos that had just unfolded. She wasn't sure how long she sat in the dark, but by the time she gathered the courage to stand, the house felt empty. The man who had once been her partner in everything had become a stranger. The woman who had dreamed of a future in Hollywood was trapped in a life she no longer recognized. Dorothy stared at herself in the mirror, the reflection staring back at her like a stranger. She had done everything Paul asked, followed every instruction, smiled when she had to, and yet the deeper she got into this life, the more trapped she felt. It had been weeks since that night when Paul's anger had nearly consumed her. The sting of his words still lingered in her chest, an ache that refused to go away. "I'll show you who really cares about you." But it wasn't just Paul anymore. It was her own reflection, the woman she was becoming, the woman who was losing herself in a world that didn't seem to have a place for her. She had come to Los Angeles to chase her dreams, to become someone more than just the girl in a magazine. But somewhere along the way, she had lost control, and now, she wasn't sure who she was anymore. It was a rainy evening when the decision finally came to her. She stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea, when the phone rang. Her heart skipped when she saw the name on the screen. Peter. For the first time in a long while, she smiled. He had been a constant presence in her life, someone who had listened when she needed it most, someone who saw her for who she really was, not just as a pretty face. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey, Dorothy, how are you holding up?" Peter's voice was warm, comforting, and it made her feel like she was finally being seen. I don't know anymore, Peter," she confessed, her words coming out in a rush. "I've been thinking a lot. About everything. About Paul. About me." There was a pause on the other end, and Dorothy could almost hear Peter's mind racing. He knew her well enough to sense that something was wrong. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. The words she had been keeping inside for so long spilled out, faster than she could control them. "I feel like I'm losing myself, Peter. I don't even recognize the person I'm becoming. Every time I try to do something for myself, Paul gets angry. He's controlling, and I can't breathe. I can't be who I want to be." Peter's voice became firmer. "Dorothy, you don't have to stay in that situation. You're stronger than you think. You deserve better." She closed her eyes, his words sinking in like a lifeline she had been reaching for without even knowing. She had spent so much time convincing herself she could handle it, that it was just a phase, that Paul would change. But the truth was undeniable now. She had been suffocating, and every moment spent in that cage felt like a betrayal to herself. "I don't know how to leave him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." Peter's response was quiet but resolute. "You don't have to do it alone. You don't owe him anything." Her hand trembled as she held the phone. The tears she had been holding back for weeks started to spill. For the first time, Dorothy allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had been carrying. She wasn't just afraid of leaving Paul. She was afraid of losing herself completely. But this was it. She could no longer pretend. She couldn't let fear dictate her future. The decision was made. "I'm going to leave him," Dorothy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't care what happens anymore. I can't keep living like this." Peter's voice softened, almost as if he could feel her resolve. "I'm here for you, Dorothy. You don't have to do this alone." That night, Dorothy packed her things. Each item she placed in the suitcase felt like a weight being lifted from her shoulders. The clothes, the shoes, the little mementos, everything that had once tied her to Paul felt less like possessions and more like burdens. The house they had shared now felt empty, a hollow shell of memories she no longer wanted to hold on to. As she stood in the doorway, ready to leave the life she had known, Dorothy looked around one last time. It wasn't the house that had been suffocating her. It was the man, the life, the version of herself she had been forced to become. She stepped out into the cool night air, the rain still falling softly around her. The city of Los Angeles, so bright and promising just months ago, now felt different. It felt like the first step towards something she had lost sight of: freedom. For the first time in a long while, Dorothy felt like she could breathe again. Dorothy stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the straps of her dress, the soft rustle of fabric filling the silence. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. She had spent the past few days sorting through the turmoil in her heart, torn between relief and uncertainty. But today would be the end. She had decided to meet Paul one last time, hoping for some resolution, some final conversation that might allow them both to part ways with a semblance of peace. But deep down, Dorothy knew that peace was no longer an option. The man she had married wasn't the same person who had first swept her off her feet in Vancouver. The man she once loved had become a stranger, consumed by jealousy, obsession, and an uncontrollable need to dominate every part of her life. This meeting wasn't going to end with a simple goodbye. Her fingers trembled slightly as she finished buttoning her coat and turned towards the door. She grabbed her purse and took a deep breath before stepping out. The air was crisp, and the city felt vast and distant as she made her way to the car waiting outside. When she arrived at their former home, the place that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. She stood there for a moment, the familiar sights of the house drawing out a deep sense of unease. She hadn't been back here since the last time she packed her things, and it felt as though the weight of everything had caught up with her. Still, she pushed the feeling aside and rang the doorbell. Paul opened the door almost immediately, his face a mix of anticipation and barely contained rage. He was dressed sharply, but there was an edge to his appearance, a sharpness that felt almost like a warning. "Dorothy," he said, his voice tight, "I've been waiting." She forced a smile, though it felt thin and unconvincing. "I know, Paul. I just thought it was time we talked." He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in, but his eyes never left hers. She walked in hesitantly, her heart beating faster with each step. She was trying to stay calm, trying to remember that this was the end of the road. She could do this. She had to. Once inside, the door shut behind her with a thud that seemed louder than it was. The house felt different now, cold and sterile, as though it no longer contained any of the warmth it once had. Paul gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, unsure of what to do. "What's this about, Dorothy?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You've been pulling away from me. You think you can just walk away from everything we've built, everything I've done for you?" She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. "Paul, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that this is healthy, that this is right. I need to move on. We both need to." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she saw the old Paul, the man who had first caught her eye in Vancouver, the charming, ambitious man who had promised her the world. But that man was gone now, replaced by someone darker, someone she no longer recognized. "You don't understand," Paul said, stepping closer to her, his voice rising. "You think you can just leave me after everything? After I've given you everything?" His hand reached out, grabbing her arm with a force that sent a jolt through her body. "You're mine, Dorothy. You'll always be mine." She pulled away from him, her chest tight with fear, but she couldn't let him see it. "No, Paul," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not yours anymore. I never was. I need to live my own life." The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the rapid rhythm of her heart. Paul stood there, his grip on reality faltering, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked at her as though he could barely recognize the woman standing before him. His gaze was filled with confusion, rage, and desperation. "How could you do this to me?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, Dorothy?" She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him how much he had hurt her, how much she had tried to hold on, but all she could do was stare at him, wondering if he would ever truly understand. And then, in an instant, the tension snapped. Paul's expression shifted from hurt to anger in a flash, his face contorting with a madness she hadn't seen before. He reached for the shotgun that had been resting against the wall, his hands shaking as he grabbed it. "Dorothy, you can't leave me. You're mine. You will stay," he hissed, his voice now dangerously calm. Her blood ran cold as she took a step back. "Paul, please don't do this. We can work through this. We can talk." But the words were lost in the chaos of his spiraling mind. He raised the gun, his finger on the trigger. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to close in around her. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a stranger, a broken man, consumed by his obsessions. "Goodbye, Dorothy," he whispered. And then, the sound of the shotgun blast shattered everything. The sound of the shotgun echoed in Dorothy's ears even after everything went silent. The world seemed to collapse around her in that one moment. The air was thick, heavy with disbelief, and she could barely comprehend what had just happened. Her body was still standing, but everything in her mind felt as though it had come to a grinding halt. She had tried to reach out, tried to reason with him, but Paul's mind was lost, consumed by the rage that had always simmered beneath the surface. The next moments were a blur. Dorothy's eyes fixed on the floor, her body trembling as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. The room felt colder, the space now too vast for her to understand. There was a sickening sense of finality in the air, a terrifying understanding that she would never get to fix things, never get the chance to reconcile with the man she had once loved. Then there was a knock at the door. At first it sounded distant, as though it was coming from another world. But the sound persisted, pulling Dorothy out of the fog that had enveloped her. She snapped back into the moment, her breath shallow and erratic. Who could it be? Peter? The police? Her legs felt like lead, but somehow she managed to stumble to the door. Her hand gripped the handle, her body screaming for her to stop, but her mind pushed forward. She opened the door slowly, hesitating, her heart beating in her throat. Standing there was the last person she expected, Paul's roommates. They had come looking for him after realizing he had locked himself in the house for hours. Their expressions quickly turned to horror when they saw Dorothy, her face pale, her hands still trembling. Without a word, they rushed inside. "God, what happened?" one of them asked, his voice shaking as he looked at Paul's lifeless body on the floor. Dorothy opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. The reality of the situation was too much to bear. Paul, the man she had spent so many years with, was dead, and it was her last conversation with him that had sealed his fate. Tears began to well in Dorothy's eyes, but she blinked them away. There was no time for grief yet. The police were on their way, and there were still so many questions she couldn't answer, not even for herself. How had it come to this? How had she allowed it to go this far? The police arrived minutes later, their sharp eyes quickly assessing the scene. Dorothy was questioned, her every word scrutinized, as if they were trying to piece together the jigsaw puzzle of what had happened. She answered as best as she could, her voice soft and shaky, but her mind was elsewhere, still trying to process the violence that had shattered everything she once knew. "Are you okay?" one of the officers asked, looking at her with a hint of concern in his eyes. Dorothy didn't know how to answer. She wasn't okay, not by a long shot. I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. The aftermath wasn't just about the body on the floor, or the twisted and tragic end to a life she had once tried to protect. It was the crushing weight of everything that had led up to this moment. It was the realization that there had been no escape, no way to stop the violence from spilling over. Paul's jealousy, his paranoia, his need to control, it had all been building toward this tragic conclusion, and there had been nothing she could do to prevent it. The news of Paul's death spread quickly, but Dorothy was nowhere near ready to face the world. She was taken to the police station for further questioning, and there, in the sterile, cold room, she sat in silence. The clock ticked slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Paul's twisted, angry face haunted her. She could still hear his voice, feel the weight of his grip on her arm. She wondered if she would ever be free of the memory of this night. Outside, the city continued on, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded in one quiet corner of it. But for Dorothy, nothing would ever be the same. Her life, which had once been filled with hope and dreams, was now shattered, reduced to fragments she didn't know how to piece back together. The woman who had come to Hollywood to become more than just a beautiful face in a magazine had lost everything: her marriage, her safety, and ultimately her peace of mind. Now she was left to figure out how to survive in a world where everything had changed so violently, so suddenly. Dorothy stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the rain pouring down outside. The city felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the world had moved on without her. She had become a shadow in it, a person defined by a tragic event, rather than the vibrant woman she had once been. The sound of the rain was soothing, but it couldn't wash away the heaviness in her chest. The funeral had passed in a blur she couldn't quite remember but still felt in every nerve of her body. The mourners, the hushed whispers, the false sympathy, it had all been a performance, a way to give the tragedy an appearance of finality. But for Dorothy, the nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. Paul's death had shattered her, yes, but it had also changed the way the world viewed her. Once a rising star, she now felt like a broken echo of that person. The media, relentless, cold, had painted her as the victim, and in a way she was. But there was no comfort in that. The cameras, the interviews, the probing questions about her marriage, none of it made the pain go away. It only reminded her of the man she had tried to save, the man she had loved and lost. And now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that felt like it had been stolen from her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Peter. "I've been thinking about you. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk." She hadn't spoken to Peter in days, weeks even. The guilt of the affair, if it could even be called that, had weighed heavily on her. She hadn't meant for things to escalate with him, but he had been there when she needed someone to listen. She couldn't escape the guilt, though, the nagging feeling that she had failed Paul, that she had failed them both. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words came. She wanted to reach out to Peter, to allow herself to feel something other than pain, but part of her was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if she let herself be vulnerable again. The fear of being hurt, of losing control, was too much. She put the phone down, pushing it away as if it were an object too heavy to lift. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. She needed to find a way to move forward, but every step felt impossible. Every thought felt like a weight she couldn't carry. Dorothy knew she needed help. The idea of seeing a therapist had been in her mind for weeks now, but the thought of confronting her emotions, of truly facing everything she had been through, felt insurmountable. How could she even begin to make sense of it all? How could she explain to someone that she had spent so many years trying to fix a broken relationship, only to find herself standing at the end of it, empty and alone? And then there was the guilt that gnawed at her. The guilt for having loved Peter in the way she had, even if it had been innocent at first. She had never wanted to betray Paul, but the emotional distance between them had become too much to bear. Peter had seen her, really seen her, and that had made her feel alive in a way that nothing else had. Yet now that Paul was gone, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed him. She had tried to hold on, to make things work, but in the end, it wasn't enough. She couldn't save him. She couldn't save herself either. The guilt was suffocating, and it felt like it would crush her if she allowed it to. She wanted to scream, to tear at the walls of the life she had built, but she couldn't. She had been in survival mode for so long that she didn't know how to stop. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She stood there for a moment, wondering if it was just another unwanted visitor, another reporter, another person wanting to know what happened. She wasn't ready for that. But when she opened the door, it wasn't a stranger waiting on the other side. It was her mother. "Oh, Dorothy," her mother said, pulling her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say." Dorothy didn't say anything. She just stood there, her mother's arms around her, feeling like the last piece of her humanity was being held together by the only person who had ever truly understood her. The next few days passed in a blur. Her mother stayed with her, comforting her in a way that only mothers could. They talked, but not about what had happened. They didn't need to. They both knew the weight of it, and talking about it wouldn't bring Paul back. It wouldn't fix anything. But slowly, Dorothy began to feel something shift inside her. It wasn't a clear, defined change, but it was there, a tiny spark of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. She didn't know how yet, but she had to, for her sake, for the sake of the woman she still hoped to become. The weeks after the funeral dragged on, but it felt like the world was still holding its breath, waiting for the aftermath to settle. Dorothy's life, once filled with a whirlwind of flashing lights and endless possibilities, now felt like a quiet echo of its former self. The media had moved on, as they always did, leaving her to deal with the silent, unspoken weight of everything that had happened. Peter had been a constant presence in her life, offering a gentle hand of support whenever she needed it. He had been the one person who hadn't looked at her with pity or judgment, but even Peter's well-meaning concern could not fully fill the hollow space inside her. She was still haunted by what had transpired, by the loss of Paul, by the finality of it all. Dorothy had told herself she was moving on, that she was learning to cope, but the truth was, she was just surviving. The days felt like a blur, and at night she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the tragic events that had led to Paul's death. Then came the letter. It arrived on a cool afternoon, the envelope plain and unassuming, almost as if it didn't belong to the chaos of her life. The handwriting on the front was familiar, Paul's handwriting. She froze for a moment, the world around her stopping as her eyes scanned the letters on the envelope. It couldn't be, she thought. He's gone. But the truth was undeniable. This was his handwriting. She tore it open with shaking hands, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter inside was brief, the words crude, almost desperate. I know what you've done. You think you can escape me, but you can't. I will always find you, Dorothy. Her breath caught in her throat as she read those words again, her mind racing. How was this possible? Paul was dead. He couldn't have written this. But the handwriting was unmistakably his. She sank to the floor, the letter crumpling in her hands as the room spun around her. This can't be happening, she thought, her body shaking as she tried to process the impossible. Her mind swirled with questions. Was this some sick joke? Had someone been watching her? The thought that someone could be watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike, made her skin crawl. She had been trying to move on, trying to rebuild her life, but now it seemed like the past was reaching out to pull her back in, trapping her once more in the cycle of fear and uncertainty. The weight of the letter was unbearable. It felt like Paul's presence was still there, lingering in the shadows, a haunting reminder of the man who had once promised her everything, only to take it all away. Dorothy couldn't escape the feeling that Paul's death hadn't been the end. It had only been the beginning of something much darker. A knock on the door broke her reverie. Dorothy froze, her heart pounding as she slowly stood up, still holding the letter in her hand. She had no idea who it could be. Her mind flashed back to the countless times she had opened the door to strangers, the press, or even friends pretending to be concerned. But this felt different. The door opened slowly, and she looked up, startled to see Peter standing there. His expression was serious, his face drawn with concern. I didn't mean to startle you, he said softly. I was just checking in. How are you holding up? Dorothy swallowed hard, her eyes glancing nervously at the crumpled letter still clutched in her hand. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't feel safe anymore, Peter. I don't know who's doing this, but it's like I'm being watched, and it's not just in my head. Peter stepped closer, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, Dorothy. We'll figure this out together. You don't have to carry this burden by yourself. But even as he spoke, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another attempt to quiet her fears, another attempt to make her feel like things would be okay. Because deep down she knew, things would never be okay again. The truth was, Paul's death had left a permanent scar on her soul. She couldn't forget it, no matter how hard she tried. The letter was proof of that. It was a warning, a reminder that no matter how far she ran, she could never outrun the ghosts of her past. Peter, I don't think this is over, Dorothy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I think he's still out there. Peter looked at her, his brow furrowing in concern. What do you mean? She held up the letter, the words glaring at them both as if daring them to believe it. He wrote this. He promised he'd always find me. Peter's expression darkened as he read the letter, his face falling. He didn't say anything at first, but Dorothy could see the worry in his eyes. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken fears. She had thought she was free, but now it seemed like the past had caught up with her, and the shadows that had once lurked in the corners of her mind were closing in on her again. Dorothy stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out at the city that had once felt so full of promise. The skyline stretched before her, lights flickering in the distance, each one a life she had once dreamed of living. But now, everything seemed distant, obscured by the heavy fog of grief and regret that clung to her. The past year had shattered her in ways she never imagined. First, the dizzying heights of fame, then the painful descent into the nightmare of an abusive marriage, and finally, the tragic end of it all. Paul's death had torn apart the very fabric of her life, and now she was left to sift through the ruins, trying to find something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. She had been trying to rebuild herself, trying to piece together the broken fragments of the woman she once was. But it was hard. Every corner of her apartment, every familiar sound brought memories of him, the man she had once loved and now could barely recognize. The violent confrontation, the letters, the threats. It all felt like a dream, an awful nightmare she couldn't escape. Her phone buzzed on the table behind her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Peter, his words kind and reassuring. But Dorothy couldn't bring herself to respond. She had pushed him away, as she had pushed everyone else. The guilt of her past decisions weighed too heavily on her heart. She thought about the letter she had received, the one written in Paul's unmistakable handwriting. She hadn't been able to shake the fear that his death hadn't been the end of his grip on her. It had felt like a warning, a chilling reminder that no matter how far she ran, the past was always waiting to catch up. And then, there was the matter of her future. Where did she go from here? The life she had built in Hollywood was in ruins, and the person she had once been, the young woman with dreams of stardom, felt like a distant memory. The woman she was now was broken, lost in a world where she didn't know her place. But in the silence of that moment, standing on the balcony, Dorothy realized something. She didn't need to keep running. She couldn't erase the past, but she could choose how to move forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was the only option she had left. The loss she felt, the grief of what had happened, of what she had lost, was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But it was no longer something that would define her. She had spent so long fighting to survive, to escape the grip of a past that held her captive. But now, for the first time, she understood that survival wasn't enough. She needed to find peace. She needed to find herself again. Dorothy took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a start. She knew that there would be days when the weight of the past would crush her, when the memories of Paul and everything they had shared would feel too heavy to bear. But those days wouldn't define her. She would not let them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Dorothy felt the faint stirrings of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She wasn't the same person she had been when she arrived in Los Angeles. She had been broken, shattered by the choices she had made, by the life she had been forced to live. But now, standing here, she realized that she still had the power to shape her own future. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from her mother. She hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to feel. "Dorothy." Her mother's voice was soft but firm. "I know things are hard right now, but you don't have to do this alone. We'll get through this together." The words, simple and genuine, were the reminder Dorothy needed. She wasn't alone. And even if the road ahead was long, she wasn't going to walk it by herself. "Thanks, Mom," Dorothy whispered, her voice shaky but steady. "I'll be okay. I think I'm finally ready to move on." And with that, she turned away from the balcony and walked back inside, taking the first step toward the future she had once thought was impossible. What do you think of Dorothy Stratten's tragic story? From which region are you watching this video? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.